Lieve, thank you very much for your honest, I could almost say true story of your Rebels Hour. Wasn't there anything in the Dutch response to the book that hinted at the fiction, non-fiction, literary conundrums you have been discussing?
Not that I can remember. It really, the first time it really came up when it came out in the US. Yeah, that's when there was a certain meanness that had to do with what the book was covered with the prefatory note, with no.
And without all those caveats and notices and author's note and publisher's note, if that would all have been left out of the book, would people then have noticed that there was something to notice?
Well, I think that the American publisher knew what was coming, or what was possibly coming, and that's why they asked me to. They tried to protect, and somehow it wasn't. You couldn't protect it somehow because there was something out there. It also has to do, of course, with the fact that when the publisher, by the way, Maarten was not my publisher anymore, since we are talking about inside things. He wasn't my publisher anymore, but he sold the book to America at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And I think that, of course, the Americans couldn't read it before they bought it, and then they bought it as non-fiction, and when they saw it, they saw that some things had happened to the material. And I think that why in Europe something like that didn't happen is because people had read the two former books. And Back to the Congo, written in the 80s, Dance of the Leopard, written just before the Rebels Hour. Like they were preludes to this third book, and it was just like as if one part of the second book had been highlighted, and that was the Rebels Hour. While in the States, Back to the Congo had been published a long time ago. The editor had disappeared; he had died even. So it was a long time ago.
Okay.
So
some of your previous books have met with reality after publication as well. Your book on Hungary, The Melancholy Revolution, your book on Syria, The Gates of Damascus. So it isn't. This was different, I realize, but you have experienced before that books that you have written have a sort of an echo in reality after publication. One could see that as a problem. One could also see that as a compliment to the relevance and the liveliness and the actuality of what you write and how you write.
Well, yeah, it's real people. As I always say, they are in the book, but then their arms and their head and their foot are sticking out, and the book is somewhere in the middle of them, and it's alive. And when you publish it in another language, something else happens with it. For instance, when the Rebels Hour was going to come out in French, the rebel whose life this book was based on has read it in manuscript. The former in The Gates of Damascus and with the Hungary book, the people who are important in the book, usually as soon as it gets translated, before it's being published, I try to make them read it. And even with the Rebels Hour, for certain small parts were changed. The man I live with said, "This guy's got a gun, so you better be sure that nothing bad is going to happen to you after it gets published." With the Hungary book, to my great surprise, there was this wonderful family that received me and that I wrote about because I lived in their house, and Hungary was moving, was 89. It was a melancholy revolution, as I called it in the title. And this was a wonderful family, young man and his brother and a divorced couple. And the sons, one of them became a cinematographer, and the other became, he made special effects for American science fiction movies. And they somehow were abhorred when they saw that they were so many years younger in my book, I sent it to them just thinking that they would be so happy or what, and then I had to change, I changed the sex of one of the boys so as to make it, well, of course in Hungary anybody who knows me and who knows them knows what had happened, but I had to alter certain things, yeah. And with The Gates of Damascus, which is a book about a young woman I knew when we were both 25, we met in Iraq, and in the beginning of the 90s her husband was in prison for political reasons. I spent half a year in her life and I explained our life during this period. And she of course never asked that somebody would write a book about her, and her husband was in prison, so we were being watched, and I was very much afraid that something would happen if the book came out in French. But then the authorities don't care about those type of books, so we were afraid for nothing. And yeah, but it's true, these books are live material, and when the Dutch is still an umbrella, it's still protected when you're published in Dutch, but as soon as the book travels back to its harbor, which I think is the most beautiful moment. A book for me is only, I can just feel what the book is if the people who I write the book about read it, and the people who from the country that I write. But I mean, I've been in prison in Congo because of what I've wrote in Dance of the Leopard once as well. I was in Kisangani, a city in the interior, and I describe in Dance of the Leopard, they didn't have cars at the time, only little bicycles, and you would sit in the back of a bicycle on a little embroidered cushion, and I'm sitting on this cushion, and I pass by the window of a doctor who makes an advertisement that he studied in Greece. And I say, well, nobody else in the world would think that was really something wonderful to have studied that. Now, I didn't even write the name of the doctor, but a friend of his got the book, and one day I was on the UN plane going from Bunia to Kinshasa, to the capital, and we had to stop in Kisangani. Was taken out of the plane, my passport was taken, I was brought to this prison where all the windows were broken so I could still communicate with the outside, which helped me at the end because my friends got me out. But there was a lawsuit against me by this doctor. Yeah, sometimes you wish the book to be there, but not yourself, to travel afterwards.
Great. Still, we also in the morning we've been discussing fictional elements in non-fiction, and perhaps more correctly phrased as literary techniques used in the writing of non-fiction. Especially when you phrase it thus, that you use literary techniques in your non-fiction books, that is not something that you would have to apologize for. And when I hear you speak about the non-fiction police, there is an anxiety in what you say that I wish we could shed, because there's nothing wrong here except that you tell a story. Or is there another source for your anxiety?
Well, for instance, in, let's say, The Gates of Damascus, it's different from this book because the third person really has other rules. I remember in The Gates of Damascus, I arrived in the beginning of the 90s. The first Gulf War has been on, and you know, as a Westerner, you have all these images, and then you come to the home of your friend, and the first weeks you're just quarreling all the time because you have to get rid of the images that you have from back home. She has another way of looking. And I remember when I started writing, I was tempted to write about these quarrels. And then suddenly I said, but before making the dish, I'm going to break it. So let's not talk about this before. And then I just put it in the end of the book. In the end of the book, when I'm about to go, suddenly we quarrel a lot. And that was a more appropriate moment to put it in the book. So in that way, of course, I don't feel any reluctance to do that, and I have always felt free, and I've never questioned that. But with the Rebels Hour, what happened was that suddenly they said, oh, but if this was stand-in, who is it? Is this you? But then why didn't you say it was you? And you know, so it was once, and this is why I must say that while I was writing this little piece, I've spent 2 days in my home very depressed, because I was looking at all these reviews again and going through this period of this book traveling into the world, and then somebody kicking it and so. But I wanted very much today to explain a little bit how this came about. It was really something that I hadn't planned, but it was like the only way to do it. And then because I did it that way, suddenly people had questions which they didn't have with my other books.
Are there other cases, books by other writers that you can link to the case you have described?
Well, I'm sure that some people here, we are all always abhorred to think that's what would happen to you, what happened to the woman who wrote The Bookkeeper of Kabul.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. The guy who he would be sitting here today and stand up and give his point of view. He turned up at conferences and sued her, I think also. So he didn't win, by the way, I guess.
I don't think he did.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think they agreed on
yeah. Well,
I remember such an ugly case. At Möllenhof years ago, we published a historical novel about Athanasius Kircher, and in this book there was also the whole Nachleben of Kircher with a suspect crypto criminal Athanasius Kircher Society, still active in Germany today. And we were promoting translation rights of the book in our booth at the Frankfurter Buchmesse, when 2 of the members of this Athanasius Kircher Society came really to knock the whole booth down. So we were so angry that we were sort of promoting this book, which put them in such a bad light. So fictional techniques can come back at you. Yes.
Yes, but I think that it's very important that the people, if you really are planning to write about somebody at length, that this person from the beginning should know. And of course, for instance, in Congo, this guy, the doctor who studied in Greece, very often people haven't read also. Like for instance, when I was in front of the guy who was suing me, and he said, how are you going to resolve this problem, you think? And what do you do with this if this happens in your country? Something like that. I said, well, we will maybe sit and then go to a cafe and, oh, you think one beer will solve the problem? Well, it won't. You know, so it's also because people aren't used with, and I can understand that, with the look of the other on you. It's cruel, I can imagine. There was, the other day I was in France with a woman who was just one sentence in the book. We were sitting with a Senegalese guy, and suddenly she said, sure, he was selling drugs in France before. And she said, when I read this, oh my God, I was appalled that I'd said something like that. So, of course, I mean, I wouldn't, I think, like to be the main character in a book. Because then all these things would happen that you fear when you are.
You asked yourself just now, could I have written it differently? Should I have written it differently? No doubt you have thought a lot about this. Would there have been alternative ways of treatment that would have fulfilled your literary ambition?
I sometimes think, why couldn't I make myself a character in that book? I think the situation was too complex in front of this huge subject to make myself play a role in it. But later on, you think again. And I remember my publisher, who is here as well, not only was this a complicated book, I also jumped back and forth in time. Recently the book came out in Polish, and the man I live with is Polish, and I said, have a look at what the reviewers say. And he said, oh, already the situation in Poland is so complicated, but she makes it the more complicated by jumping in time. And I remember that my publisher at a certain moment said, I'm going to try and make it straight from chronologically. And then I said, you won't be able to. And she looked at it and she said, no, I can't. So, I don't know, it's the only book that I sometimes think I should, if somebody would give me 2 years or something, maybe I could look at it again. But on the other hand, it's also a book that taught me a lot. And some people have accepted it, so that's all right as well.
What is the most important thing it taught you? Can you phrase it?
Oh well, go and talk to Anand and then I will tell you afterwards.